Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. We will be starting shortly, and we're just allowing just a couple more participants to come into the room, and then we will be started with the conversation. Delwyn, thank you for joining from Bangor, Northern Ireland. Welcome. And Stephen, thanks for joining this evening. Okay, we're going to give it just one more minute and then we will get started. Hi, Rodney, welcome. And I will let Rob know that Rodney says hello. Hi, Lorna from London. Thanks for joining. Welcome. Hi, Dennis from Bristol. We have a nice range from the UK at the moment, so thank you for joining. Oh, we have Ashley from Miami. Hi, Ashley. Welcome to Breaking Through the Middle UK. All right. Good evening, everyone. I think it's my last good evening for the night. My name is Sabrina Clark Okubanego, and I am your host for this evening. I am also the founder and CEO of Build Global. Build Global is a transformation advisory, and we are committed to building businesses that last. Transformation, commitment, building, lasting are the adjectives that I would use to describe what we've seen over the past few months with the protests with George Floyd, to brands, organizations, companies recognizing that there is a need to be more specific when we talk about diversity and racial equality. And then to the viral moment that got all of us on this panel today. It started with a LinkedIn post by Tony Effick with a simple hashtag that said BlackandBrilliant. And I, along with hundreds of other people, were tagged in to demonstrate there are Black and Brilliant senior representation globally. And that hashtag, that moment, has turned into a global advocacy network founded by both Tony and Perky Effick. This advocacy network supports people from all backgrounds and specifically looks to ensure that there is representation of Black and Brilliant talent. Our chapter, the Black and Brilliant UK chapter, is led by Ete Davies, who is a CEO of Engine. And you will hear from Ete Davies a little later on this evening as he shares the aims, the ethos, and the manifesto for the UK specifically. Tonight is the inaugural Black and Brilliant UK chapter panel, and we'll be looking at breaking through the middle specifically. As you can see with the slide in front of us, we have a stellar panel of individuals who I am going to introduce quite shortly. If we could progress, Mutessa, to the next couple of slides. Thank you very much. And we'll stay here for a moment. I talked about who we are in terms of Black and Brilliant and how the group was started. Tonight, Breaking Through the Middle is going to be one of those conversations, the conversations that we have on our WhatsApp groups, the closed LinkedIn groups, where we share our authentic voices, opinions in a safe space. We want to have a conversation with you as the panelists are speaking. As you saw me do when we entered the room, I'm going to be looking at what's going on in the chat and bringing that in the conversation. Having said that, I will be asking you various questions specific to the conversation tonight. And we're looking at 4 main themes. Now, let's take a step back and remind everyone that we're not going to cover everything. That's not the intention. The intention is to have a foundational conversation covering 4 key topics, but this is one of a series of discussions that you will witness in terms of our network. So how we're breaking it down will be from me talking to you right now, between now and up to 7:15, if not sooner. moving straight into the panel discussions from 7:15 to 8:20, and included within that will be questions that I pose to you, questions that we would like for you to ask the panelists. And then lastly, you'll hear from Ete Davies, as I mentioned earlier. And so what I want to do is test it now so you can get used to responding to us as we then give you some insight. So if I could ask the tech team to put the first question up so everyone can get used to responding. It is anonymous, so please be honest with your response. The first question is, have you been strategic or reactive about your career journey to date? Strategic or reactive, or both, about your career journey to date? And as you are responding to that question, I'm going to take this time to introduce our stellar panelists. So our first panelist is Claire Anderson. Claire is the Vice President in the engineering division at Goldman Sachs. She joined the firm in 2010, focused on delivery of large-scale transformational projects. During her time at the firm, she has worked on a number of initiatives, from physical commodities trading systems implementation to the Rothsay Life divestment and separation project. More recently, Claire led the financial services compensation scheme implementation for the firm's new retail business, Marcus by Goldman Sachs, and the UK bank entity as a whole. She managed front to back product readiness for Brexit and is now leading the global engineering program for LIBOR remediation, excuse me. Welcome, Claire. We then have Kwesi Afum, and Kwesi is Vice President of Impact Assessment at Barclays and a member of the Barclays Embrace Multicultural Network, COO. He is also the co-founder of Future Banking, Slow Money, a property entrepreneur, and advisory board member of charities and local community projects. Career-wise, over the last decade, Kwesi has gained distinctive experience at several Tier 1 investment banks, including Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Deutsche Bank. Welcome, Kwesi. Rob Scotland, our next panelist, is the head of strategy at McCann London. Rob is a modern cultural anthropologist and ethnographer, observing, analyzing, and understanding audiences for business purposes. He has advised some of the biggest brands in the world, such as Adidas, Samsung, Nike, Pandora, Gap, Sudera, Ferrari, and Formula One, on how they can authentically capture the hearts and minds of their target audiences. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Yemi Jackson. Yemi Jackson is the CEO and founder of Engage Transform, a talent acquisition and development company with the mission of increasing the placements of women and BAME talent in senior positions in science, technology, engineering, and maths. Yemi has over 25 years work experience and was senior executive in finance and IT before setting up Engage Transform to counter the critical need for a more engaged and diverse workplace that begins with sourcing the right talents, the right candidates. Welcome to our esteemed panel. The poll is now closed. And before we share results, can I ask all of our panelists, and thank you, Matessa, we can stop sharing the screen for now so we can focus on our panelists. If I could just go straight across the board in the order that I am seeing. And the question is, have you been strategic, reactive, or both? One word. Rob, have you been both?
Both.
Yemi. Yemi?
Both.
Claire?
Both.
Kwesi?
Strategic.
Okay, and can we share the results, please? So 56% of everyone on the call have all been both. And so since you were the outlier, I'll start with you first, Kwesi. How have you been strategic with your career portfolio to date?
I think I didn't start out to be strategic, but from the start of my career, one of the things that people say both. I wish I could have been both. Actually, I would have considered a luxury to have been able to be both. But things always happened in a way that I had to be strategic. I had to make a decision, take a direction. I think so, for some, maybe I'm just unlucky, but for some reason there were so many turning points in my career where I could have waited. Maybe I should have waited, but instead I took the strategic move and took the move that I thought would get me to where I wanted to be, instead of waiting to see if things panned out and reacting to it.
Okay. And thank you, Crazy Yummy. You've been both as an approach. So how have you been able to move between both, being both strategic and reactive?
I think for me personally, I think it changes as you go up your career. So when I first started, I suppose the kind of a story where I started was, I mean, what would you do if you are your first job, you're left in the office to man it for 2 days, everybody else has gone off on a, team building day. And that was the position I was in my first job. Basically, the team had gone off to a wonderful building day, left a little black girl in the office to man the phones. I was a temporary staff in this accounts payable department. I didn't get bitter. I just used that opportunity to reorganize everything. So by the time they came back, they had fantastic feedback, and that's how my career started. So it wasn't strategic. It was the fact that I was left with a position of either being bitter and going off for 2 hours, lunch break, or actually do something. And that's what I did. And that's how I got offered my very first permanent role as an accountant. And that organization ended up sponsoring me to qualify. And actually, I was the first Black girl offered a permanent role in that company. And that's how I started. So that was a bit of a luck to, could call it strategic. I just took the best of the opportunity I had at that point. But as you go up, you have to be more strategic. You can't muddle through, or else you just will find that you end up not achieving much in your career, really. So I was in the middle part of my career, I muddled through. But then once I got to understand what I had to do, I got back on being more strategic.
Okay, so thanks, Yemi. We had both Kwesi and Yemi talk about the strategic, though Yemi has adapted a strategy of being both. Rob, can you give an example of how you were reactive? So you've done strategic and reactive. Can you give an example of how you were reactive with your approach to your career?
Yeah, I think one of the key points that's happened to me is just the opportunities have arisen where you've had to make a decision and react. I think it's a definition of kind of a shared of what Yemi and both Kwesi have said from that point of view. So there's been certain relationships that have been fostered, and then an opportunity has arisen where a career opportunity has been given or at least offered, and then you have to make a decision. And sometimes that timing isn't perfect. I've had that several times in my career when I wasn't anticipating making a move or using an opportunity or moving with a particular move, a strategic move that it ended up being. But you have to evaluate as and when it arrives, really. And sometimes, especially when you're leading a team, that can be quite tough, because you have to take a personal decision that's good for yourself and your family, but may not be good for the team that you're necessarily leading. On other occasions, you stay too long in a situation and you don't react fast enough to something. And it's a bit like a relationship from that point of view. So I've been both, but I definitely agree with both Kwesi and Yemi in terms of how you have to at least be strategic. The higher you go up your career, and the more you do that, the more practice you get, hopefully.
Thank you, Rob. Claire, just bringing you into this conversation, if we take a step back and think about long before you were promoted into the position that you're in now, managing and leading all the global projects that you have now, think back to your junior self. What is one example when you were back in your junior self that you would consider to be either strategic or reactive that ended up being a mistake?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always going to learn from something that happens. So the word, I guess, a mistake isn't necessarily a bad thing in many ways, because all of those experiences essentially lead you to where you need to be. And whether or not it's, going into the wrong role or making, a decision that wasn't right at the time, or you felt was right at the time, but turned out not to be. Ultimately, you learn from those experiences. So I always try and think of those mistakes as, something that I can always build upon going forward. And then hopefully, you don't make those same mistakes going forward. I think, previously in an earlier role, I took a job that I knew was going to be made redundant in a few years. I took it out of necessity at the time, but I really wasn't necessarily interested in that specific role. It was like a 2-hour journey to get to the office. It was working with people that I didn't necessarily gel with, but I felt like I needed to do that. And really within that role, I had an inkling, but it was confirmed for me that this was not the space that I wanted to be in. And I didn't last very long there. And I actually didn't do as well as I would like there, because I think there was so much other stuff going on that I wasn't able to bring my best, because it wasn't actually the best role for me. But I learned from that. I made some really good relationships, and I was actually able to build on those when it came to actually looking for a new role. And so the role was meant to be for 2 years. I actually left after about 8 months, and parted amicably, you know, but I knew that it wasn't right at the time, and it definitely wasn't when I was going through it. But I learned from that, right? And so I'm much more deliberate, even if there is a necessity, I'm much more deliberate about the roles I'm going to take going forward. And I just made sure I made much smarter moves going forward, and made sure I saw myself kind of moving forward within that new role, as opposed to, you know, just doing something as a stopgap.
Thanks, Claire. And similar question to you, Kwesi, because you made the reference earlier that because of the context that you were in, you've had to be strategic. There were certain things that you had to do because of your specific context. So thinking back to your junior self, before you were the side hustler, property person, board advisor, and everything else you're doing under the sun, what was that, or an example of a step that you made and you took that was a mistake, and what was the impact?
I mean, I always say to people that the more successful you are, you're only successful as a result of your mistakes. So I always look back on mistakes in a constructive way, as in I learned from all my mistakes, and without them I wouldn't be doing all the stuff that I'm doing now. So I can name all my mistakes. I think about them a lot. I go back over them a lot. You know,
just do one, not all, just one.
Yeah. But I remember, for example, maybe somewhat similar, really early in my career, my first ever job, that was internship. And I ended up leaving there actually to get my job. That job got me a job at Goldman Sachs. But that job at Goldman Sachs was a job that I hadn't even dreamed of from the kind of background, the environment that I come from. I didn't even know Goldman Sachs was when I graduated, when I was graduating from uni. My final year, I found out who they were. So I was in a position where I already had a job. I managed to get something I'm doing, but then another opportunity came. And I think the mistake that I made, probably, I say this because Claire mentioned relationships, is in that scenario, I burned a lot of relationships. And so I left that, and I think about it a lot. I learned that lesson, so I've never made that mistake again. And I have great relationships with everywhere that I've worked, everywhere that I've left. I've gone back to since then, I've gone back to every company that I've worked to in a certain way. So, you know, I always maintain those relations. But I think for me, the key thing back then was I was young, I was naive, and I was facing an environment, a work environment, that there were certain hostilities in I didn't necessarily understand because of my youth. And there was an exuberance that they didn't necessarily appreciate. So those two things were juxtaposed. And if, you know, again, I'm wiser. If I were back then, I would have handled it differently. I think the hardest thing about that situation for me is that the hostility, the aggression that I felt that came from my boss, who was a Black woman. And that was something that I was totally unprepared for. There was nothing in my toolkit to get me to deal with that. So yeah, I made loads of mistakes in that, but just the whole handling of that situation was a mistake. I did lots of stuff I probably shouldn't have done. I left in not a very nice way. I basically, in the end, when I left, I didn't have the job at Goldman Sachs lined up, but I knew I'd developed this relationship I could cultivate. So I decided one day I was going to leave. And that day I went to my boss and I said to my boss, you know what, I want to leave. My boss was like, okay, why? I'm like, because I don't like it here. And he said to me, okay, well, your notice period is 4 weeks, whatnot. And I said to him, as I pulled out a piece of paper from my pocket, that actually, according to the standard operating procedures, having highlighted the correct sections, I can leave at any point if the manager agrees and you are my manager. So, and yeah, you know, maybe I should have handled it differently. And the other bit I did say is, prior to me saying I want to leave, I was actually my one-to-one, and we spent an hour going through my one-to-one. We had the whole discussion. At the end of the discussion, he probably thought we'd agreed something. But then I said to him, actually, you know what, I want to leave. And so within those 2 hours, was probably not the best way to handle that situation. And yeah, that was a big mistake. But that was, but to come back to your point, I think that was strategic, because even in that point, I've been thinking about this. To him, he probably came into the meet, had the one-to-one, we prepared it. He thought, yeah. Then it was all sudden to him. No, I've been thinking about this for weeks, and the two people that I developed a relationship with, I've been really nice to, they put me in touch with somebody else. I knew that was an avenue. I knew that if I left, I had nothing to go to, but I had stuff I could work on. And so I went into that room thinking, you know what, actually, if the conversation goes route A, it will lead to this outcome. If we have the discussion and he says to me, yep, this is what we're going to offer you, this is how we're going to do it, blah, blah, maybe I'll stay. If we have the discussion and it gets to a point where I think actually it's not going to get me where I want to go, then I'm going to leave. And so that was strategically decided up front. And I went in.
So I think you're addressing some key points, and I think it's important to summarize right before we turn into reminding people. First of all, if you are tweeting #BlackandBrilliant, please. And I'm about to ask you guys if you have questions for the panelists. So I've seen some questions come in already. But to summarize some of the key things that I've heard both of you say, and I didn't plant this, but they both said the same thing. Learning from your mistakes, not viewing your mistakes as failures, but using it as learning opportunities to be able to apply to the next situation. To Kwesi's point, walking into that room with his manager, knowing that it can go one of two ways, and based on these outcomes, this is what I want to get from that situation. So very, very important. I have a question from Abba. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. And Yemi, I'm going to pose this question to you. How do you know when the time is right to make a career move?
Oh, well, I mean, I think basically you need to be thinking about what are the opportunities. If there are no opportunities for you internally, and you're no longer growing, you really do need to be thinking about moving. I would suggest, though, before you do move, it should be at least a 3-month plan. Yeah. So what you need to be thinking about, first of all, do explore the opportunities internally, because unless you're having the right conversation, you may not know. There may be opportunities internally. So, as Kwesi said, we all made mistakes. I know one of the jobs that I left, I only found out I was actually on the line for succession planning to CFO, but I only found out afterwards. But I just got frustrated. I didn't know what was going on, and I thought there was no opportunities for me. If truth be told, I suppose I should have been told, but I just thought, look, I'm going to go. Yeah. So maybe it was the wrong move for me, but you need to be having conversations with your bosses, and potentially those that are equivalent to your bosses outside of the, in departments you're to work, and explore the opportunities internally first. That's my advice, because it always looks better on your CV if you've been promoted internally first, even if you decide to move. It just looks good. Yeah, that's my advice. So is that helpful? Hopefully.
It is. Thanks, Yemi. We got a comment from Antoinette saying that Kwesi, that's some exuberance and confidence. So based on the interaction with your manager at the time. And so Yemi is talking about scouting, looking for if there are opportunities or not, the importance of communication or lack thereof in her particular instance. Just wanting to pull in you, Rob, on this, because you've talked about leading a team, managing a team, and you've moved countries. So any other additional insights to add in terms of the right time to make a career move?
I think the key thing you've got to do is evaluate what this move could do for your narrative. Something that I always talk about to my students and to my kind of junior colleagues is, I've been in the way where people have left my team, but when it's been really clear that the move has helped their narrative. And I think it's one of those things where you need to evaluate that fully as much as you can. Lord knows, if anybody had taken a job in March this year, you probably would not have seen the pandemic coming. So all you can do is in that moment, evaluate as much as you can to decide, will this help my narrative? Will this help my career? To Yemi's point, have a really open discussion. And it needs some bravery to do that, actually, because what you discover when another opportunity comes along is that you have market value. And there's nothing as kind of seductive as knowing that there's an opportunity through somebody else who they see something that maybe your current role doesn't. But there's also nothing that focuses the mind in your current company than knowing that all of a sudden your market value is being recognized by somebody else. So use that opportunity. It's one of the only times you could probably sit there and say, okay, I've got this other role, but I'd really love to stay. What can we do to improve my terms? And that takes an incredible amount of bravery and strength, and it takes a lot of practice to get right. But hopefully forums like this can help debunk that a little bit, so you can start to understand, one, you have value, you're additive. That's the reason why another opportunity has arisen. But to Yemi's point, really dig hard into the evaluation process of what you have versus, is the grass really greener?
Thanks, Rob. So Temi just posted a question, and I think it's a nice bridge into our conversation around discussion. So Temi, I'm going to break the 4 questions you have down and start with the first one. How do you build on knowledge as a basis for promotion rather than relationships and networking? And that is a very, very, I think, important and interesting question. So everyone is nodding their head because it's quite critical. And so Claire, I'm going to start with you on that one, because we're going to be talking about networking in just a second as well. So I'll repeat it again. How do you build on knowledge as a basis for promotion rather than relationships and networking? And is this the case?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you, Temi. What I would say is, to up to a certain point in your career, like your technical brilliance or your knowledge base, or what you can do and what you can deliver, is what's going to be kind of the success criteria for your role. So people want to see you as an SME. They want to know that you can understand things, you can take a problem, you can own that fully and really deliver on those problems. And so you're expected to be, technically brilliant up to a certain point. And then as you start to get more and more senior, the expectation of brilliance is actually kind of across the board. Like if you're a VP or if you're a managing director, like the assumption is you've already done the work. You're already brilliant in whatever area it is that got you to that level. Going forward, actually, it's actually more about the networks and your sponsorship and the relationships that you have, and actually people knowing what you're doing. So, your technical brilliance is very important, and it will get you to so far. But when people are looking at promotions, and when you look at big organizations like Goldman Sachs or any of those banks, when people are talking about like who should be promoted or who should be up for the next opportunity, a lot of that is going to be about who knows what you're doing and who actually has seen your visibility. So it's going to be about, are you making people aware that you're doing all of this brilliant work? Like, who knows that apart from your manager and maybe the client that you're working for? Making sure you're sharing your story with people is very important, but it isn't something that I find that, our community and women as well are particularly comfortable doing. But it is important, especially in these large organizations, because like I said, to a certain level, your brilliance is going to be almost expected of you. And so it's about just making sure you have the right relationships that can help you, that people know that you're brilliant and they can understand that and see it more broadly.
You're absolutely right, Clint. I think, it would seem like we probably made up Temi, but we're actually going to explore this topic in more detail right now, because it's important to first identify the type of networker you are, and then understand the strategies you need to adopt based on the type of networker you are. And so let's move to that. And COVID has really been a game changer of how you are networking now versus pre-COVID, because everything was a mixture between face-to-face and LinkedIn. Right now, everything is digital. So let's get into that conversation. Tech team, if we can pop up the next survey question. What type of networker are you? Are you the observer, the reactor, the initiator, the director, or none of the above? Again, the observer, the reactor, the initiator, the director, or none of the above. And as people are responding to that, similar to before across the board, Claire, which one would you say describes you?
I'm a reactor.
Okay.
or even stand back. I am typically quite a shy and reserved person, and I'm not the most forthright, especially in those big forums. But yeah,
Okay.
I have to figure out my own way.
Okay. Crazy
Probably an initiator.
initiator. Okay. Yemi.
I would say initiator. I think more so since I've started my business, because you have to. You just
Okay. And Rob.
In real life, a reactor. Digitally, definitely an initiator.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. If we could end the poll, please, and show the results. So we have initiator. No, reactor is 34%. Okay, reactor, I was like, oh, wow, that's surprising. So 34% of the respondents are reactors. Thank you. We can stop sharing the poll results. I want to go back to the themes that you were mentioning earlier, Claire, around when you get to a certain level of seniority, or you're wanting to aspire to a certain level of seniority, people need to know who you are and know what you're doing in order for you to get there. So Yemi, Engage Transform is all about placing people in the right roles. You yourself are very good at building advocacy for your own business. So how can you be in a COVID environment? How can you be visible to build advocacy?
Okay, so I'm going to specifically focus for the professionals in terms of breaking through the middle. It took me a while to realize the importance really of the fact that apart from making sure that my relationship with my manager is really, really strong, that I needed to build relationship with people of my manager's level and above my manager's level outside of the department. Because ultimately, if for whatever reason your relationship with your manager does sour, you need other people in the room advocating for you. So in terms of sort of how can you be visible to build advocacy, whether it be COVID, outside of COVID, you need to, in the workplace, really ensure that everybody knows the value you bring to the table. And you not to be, I mean, and I think sometimes, as Claire said, we're too shy in the community. I don't know why, you know, we need to be a lot more outspoken. Not you know, not override people, but actually in, you know, if your meetings, you do need to speak up. I was always, you know, when I was in my early in my career, I was always the one making notes, you know, and actually if you think about when you're making notes, your actual body language, you're looking down and you're writing. So what you're basically saying to the rest of the people in the room, I'm the note taker for this meeting. I'm not here to participate. I'm here to make notes. So it was difficult for me to realize that, because I'm thinking, am I going to remember everything? Somehow you need to come up with a much more clever way to try and retain what is in that meeting. You are in that room to make a difference. Take that opportunity to make sure that you're visible. I can't emphasize enough, just 3 things to leave you with. Your relationship with your manager is really important. Even if the person is, you know, we all got different languages we could use for some of those horrible managers we've had, but really they are going to have weak areas. You're there to complement that. As much as it's frustrating for you, most of the time, really good managers tend to bring people that are better than them. So don't be surprised that the person you're reporting into, you may be stronger than them. Complement them, build them up, don't put them down, because when you're not in that room, they're the only person that's going to be speaking for you. And like I said, build 2 relationships up, you know, get to know people outside of your department, your manager's level, those that are above your manager's level. The other thing I would definitely encourage you to do is, in terms of, you know, when projects are going on around the organization, volunteer to go on them. Try and do as much interdepartmental projects as much as possible. I hope that's helpful. That's it.
Very helpful. Ella commented, excellent point from Yemi about the looking like the note taker if you keep your head down. I've had a couple of questions from the audience, and I just want to go to their questions as well, because it does fit into this theme. And 2 questions, I'm going to bring them together. They do reference how to do this specifically in a COVID environment, because you're not in a situation where you can be face to face. So how specifically can you build those relationships in a COVID environment? What would you suggest? So let me start with Rob on this one, and I'll come back to you again, Yemi. I think you look like you were going to say something. So Rob,
okay.
Yes,
Sorry.
let me go to Rob, and then I'll come back. Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel especially qualified for this because in my current role, I started that role during COVID. I've not actually physically met 99.9% of my colleagues in person before. And I think what I've tried to focus on a lot, especially over a screen, is to really understand what my values are and be consistent. And I think, especially when you're looking to have a relationship with people in a working context, there's some things I think people look for. They look for people that they like working with, whether they like to admit it or not. They look for people who are consistently trying to be additive and not destructive to any particular kind of situation. And the phrase which I try and use all the time, and I learned it from a very wise woman actually, was, how can I help? And I think the more you take that opportunity to try and help, regardless, it doesn't matter whether you're helping a junior member or whether you're helping the CEO, but if you can take that attitude of saying, listen, what can I do to help? How can I fit in? How can I make this work? I think you're going to get quite far. And that's equally as powerful during COVID and via electronic means as it would be physically. And hopefully, let's see what happens when everything goes back to normal. But whatever that normal is. But it'd be really interesting to see how we complement what we've learned electronically and see how that's supplemented with when we get back into kind of analog forms of behavior. A really good example of that was, I had no clue, but once I was going to an interview, and somebody was I let somebody in the door before me, they dropped something, I handed it to them. We had a brief conversation in the lift going up. And little did I know it was the CEO of the entire organization, which kind of blew my mind once we got up to the 5th floor. I was like, that picture, that's you. Okay, fine. So it's just some of those things often, if you're consistent, if I wasn't consistent, if I've been trying to put on airs and graces, if I wasn't being myself and being confident to be myself, then none of those things would have happened to that extent. So hopefully those are some tips that are universal.
Great tip. Don't step on people's things before you enter a lift. There might be the CEO. Yemi,
especially not their sandwiches. Yeah.
You were gonna add something earlier, Yemi?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the COVID world, I think a lot of people are probably a bit zoomed out. So, I mean, obviously, one of the things we're advocating, particularly in strengthening a relationship with managers, a one-to-one, even if it's not initiated by the manager, that you initiate it, but actually maybe to give them a break, give them a call. And I really, I definitely believe in the meeting before the meetings. So if there is something quite important, don't basically share it at the group team meeting so that your manager's hearing it for the first time. Either, take them aside and just make sure that you get their buy-in before you present stuff. Because that's one of the mistakes I made earlier. I thought I'd be like, da-da, and my manager will be like. So please avoid those situations. Yeah. So I think actually try and do the opposite to maybe what people are doing. Try and do some phone calls, because I think a lot of people, because when you're on camera, sometimes it can be a little bit, so actually people might appreciate a little call prior to the meeting to just make sure they are, on the same sort of page as you. That's the other tip on COVID world.
I want to get some of these questions that are coming in fast and furious. Kwesi, I'll point this question to you. What are alternative networking approaches that don't involve getting beer with leadership? And that is from Beryl. Good question, Beryl.
Beryl, that's a great question. I'll start by saying you're probably asking the wrong person. Beer, I love beer. I'm probably I'm looking for excuses to go for beer as opposed to anything. One of the downsides about my current team is we don't drink enough beer. But to be more serious, I think one of the tricks that I learned really early on in my career, Rod talked about how can I help? But one of the things that I think really worked, and I've actually done this with my current CEO. So everybody has a public profile these days. Find out something they like. What I did actually is that there's a great book by Robert Said called Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking. And I heard something that my CEO spoke about at a town hall, and he mentioned something, and I'd read the book and I thought there was a correlation. So I bought the book and I took it to his office and I said to his secretary, hey, look, this is what I've got. And she, I will leave it here. You can give it to him. He doesn't even have to know I brought it. Just like, I think this is a really cool book. I'd left a little note in the book anyway, but hey, I was like, hey, take the book, But she was like, no, just walk in. She said, just walk in and give it to him. I was like, no, it's okay. She said, just walk in, give it to him. So I walked in and gave it to him. And subsequently, I ended up hosting an event themed around fintech and diversity, future banking you mentioned earlier, which Yemi was part of, funnily enough. And he gave the closing talk at this event that Lil Me hosted. So yeah, that was a way. I didn't go for beer. I would have preferred the beer, but as an alternative, I guess getting him a book about something he was interested in based on the research that I'd done is somewhat of an alternative.
And it's a great book. So if you haven't read it, great book recommendation, please do read that. Claire, this next question I'll point to you and comes from Elizabeth, who's asking, as a senior exec, there is an emphasis on PRing yourself, your work, which you are measured by. Some people are good at PR, but not really at their jobs. How do you determine who is authentic? Should PR be a measure? And actually, Kwesi's example plays into that question, because one can view it as a PR that was authentic to him and ended up being effective because he was able to get his CEO to an event that he was hosting. So how do you determine who is authentic? How should PR be a measure?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that people that aren't genuine or who are inauthentic are always going to be caught out, right? People can tell a good story and it may work for a certain period, but if you do not have the knowledge, the technical expertise, the, whatever your skill is that you're, talking about, if you actually don't possess those features, it will come out, and often it won't come out in a very good way. For me, it's really key that whatever you do and whatever you say, you are just being genuine and you're being authentic. And I found personally the best connections and the best sponsors and network relationships I've had with people have been because of I've just talked about something very personal to me, or I've been very open about my own circumstances, and actually it's opened up a conversation and a connection with people. If I'd have gone in there and talked about being the greatest UX web designer and look at all of this stuff that I've done, I would have fallen flat on my face, because people would just be able to know that no, you don't do that and that's not your career. So I think like if people are doing that, they are going to ultimately trip up, and that's not the type of person or employee you would want to be. Ideally, you want to be known for your integrity and actually doing the things that you say you can do, but also being able to PR it. And it is a fine line. It is a balance, but I find it very, very difficult myself. It's not innate for myself to kind of promote myself in meetings and do those kind of things. I do struggle, but you just find different ways that work for you. To the earlier question about going to the pub, like I'm a mother, going to the pub isn't an option for me. But I can talk to you about, if it's Black engineers, or if it's issues going on with BLM, or if it's things to do with children, I can find a connection, even if it's football. I'm a big Spurs fan. I'm sorry if anyone else is.
No.
Hey, listen. We're not going to disrupt.
Oh dear, but I'll find that connection. Even if it's the banter, right?
Listen, we're not even you're not going to
but even if it's banter, people will resonate with the fact that they hate Spurs, and majority of Black people are going to be Arsenal or something else. So it's always a good thing to do. So
now we're going off the rails. People are putting up pictures and cameras.
Is that Arsenal?
Let's come back into the room.
Okay. So yeah, Claire.
But this is a clear demonstration to Claire's point around speaking about something that is authentic to her, and the reaction we all gave her. And I'm not going to accidentally delete her from the
Can I just pick up actually, Sabrina? Sorry, can I just pick up? And it's not about football, but actually to Temi's question earlier, and Claire made a great point about making sure that people know what you're doing.
Yes.
Great point. I'd go one further, and actually this is based on feedback that I've received quite recently. So this is kind of my own personal development point, actually, that I'm sharing with you guys. But I think the point that one of my mentors made to me, actually, is that there's, again, making sure that people know what you're doing. But actually, if you want to go one step further, if you want to get to that, as he said to me, if you want to get to that next level, you have to actually involve people and make them feel part of what you're doing. So, you may be doing loads of things and getting involved and coming up with great ideas, which is great. You can go and tell people about these great ideas that you have, which is great. But if they feel part of the idea, if they feel as though they help you construct, oh, it's part, they're part of the constructive, creative process, they'll have, that's the next level of buy-in. So yeah, I think definitely making sure people are aware of what you're doing, but also involving them to try to build those relationships. And in terms of COVID, having to do that in a post-COVID environment, I think one of the key things, whether it's actually funny enough, in my organization, we do a lot more phone calls than video or Zoom. So for us, it's probably the opposite. I would say we need to have more face-to-face, because I haven't seen my team in like 3 months. We speak like twice a day on the phone. But I think in terms of doing it post-COVID, it's to the point I'm making is you have to do something different. So if you guys have loads of Zoom calls, then you have to maybe pick up the phone to break that routine and that monotony. If you guys have loads of phone calls, maybe you have to have some video calls to break that monotony, and switching it up and creating some kind of variation. When we started, me and my team, we used House Party, which was basically like us and a bunch of 12-year-olds on this app. But I was like, hey guys, let's check out, because I saw it and I was like, hey, let's check this House Party app out, just to break the routine and the monotony. We didn't really use it. It was pretty rubbish, to be honest. But yeah, it's about trying something different.
And if anybody from House Party is on our this is Kwesi's personal opinion, and does not reflect the Black and Brilliant.
It's my personal opinion, and the App Store, just the App Store downloads. But I don't, But anyway,
on that note, we're
I
gonna
think
move
that
on
was the key point.
Yeah, perfect. So we are still getting more questions on the PRing point. And before we move on, I do think it's important to address this, particularly one last point, particularly because you do need this when you are trying to break through the middle, which is a sponsor. So we are in a COVID environment. You've all given excellent tips about how you should try to navigate those relationships. So if you're on Zoom a lot, switch to a phone call. If you're on the phone call a lot, switch to whichever app is going to work best for you. You talk about being honest, being yourself. So specifically in terms of sponsorship, how do you get a sponsor cold in a COVID environment? So you have to build up that relationship, build the work. Is there anything different that you would do apart from what you've already suggested about identifying and getting a sponsor in the COVID context? Go ahead, Rob.
I think one of the first things is we probably have to redefine the fact that you are good enough. There are things that you do that nobody else can do. There are things that you can add. So we don't always have to we don't always have to adhere to the strict kind of hierarchy that everything is about a boss, a CEO, a manager. And I think as soon as we all can kind of come to terms with that, I think it makes it much easier to get a sponsor, because what you're then doing is you're asking somebody to join you, to invest in you, to kind of see you as a vehicle through which they can actually celebrate their own success. It is one of the reasons why I coach or I teach. I don't do so for my own PR purposes. It's fantastic. It's great if you can say you're doing it. But the real kind of joy is when you see that somebody who you've tried to help, to your point earlier on, is actually doing better than you, or you're seeing things and you're like, this kid's a maniac. In 10 years, she's going to be outstripping me. It's nuts to see what's happening. And the fact I played a little part in that is awesome. So I think, first of all, just come to terms with the fact that you can be hugely additive. Don't be arrogant, but also don't adhere to the hierarchy. And that makes you imminently more attractive as a proposition for sponsorship. Otherwise, what's the point from that point of view?
Thanks, Rob. So there's a question that came up from Temi specifically to you, Kwesi, and actually that leads us into the next part of our discussion. So Temi, I've seen your question. I just want to acknowledge it, and I will come back to it in just a second. We're going to move into a conversation around navigating barriers, and I think that is the underlying thing that you're asking within your question, Temi. So tech team, if you could put the next question up for everyone to respond to, which is what has been the most significant barrier to your progression? Have they been societal barriers, organizational barriers, or personal barriers? Societal, organizational, or personal barriers? And if I just go to the panelists while we're getting people to respond to that, your response specifically. So Claire?
Organizational.
Organizational. Rob?
Personal.
Yemi?
Societal?
Kwesi? Kwesi?
Societal.
Societal. Okay, so we have a spread. If we could end the poll, please, and share the results. And so 54% of everyone is organizational barriers, though we had a spread across the panelists in terms of what barriers have been more specific to them. So I want to start this with Temi's question, because I think this context for who's in our conversation is quite important, and her question leads to what could potentially be an organizational barrier. And her question was directly to Kwesi, which was, how do you make sure while you are making sure that they are part of the creative idea, the idea does not become theirs, is the question. So essentially, you come up with a brilliant idea, you share that brilliant idea with your manager. All of a sudden, that idea is your manager's idea. How do you make, Yemi's like, she's shifting seats to get ready to answer this. How do you make sure that that idea stays yours? Because as we all know, ideas are career currency. It's how you get promoted, part of how you get promoted. So her question was directly to Kwesi. So Kwesi, what's your initial response? And I'll come to everyone else after.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I responded on that, Temi. I start actually by picking up on something Yemi said earlier, which was around most managers hire people that are better than them. So don't be surprised if you're better than your manager and you need to compliment them. I think that's very important. And again, something I didn't know early on in my career. In most of my career, probably up until my current job, to be honest, I've always been better than my manager. And that was, to me, sometimes gaping. And it was like, I don't understand why you're getting the big bucks and I'm getting pennies. I could barely buy champagne and you are buying 10, it was like, it was ridiculous. And I was complaining, but hindsight is 2020. And I think one of the things that I realized, you said that ideas are currency and you have to trade. I'm a banker, but everything is about trading. So it's about how you trade your currency you have and how you get a return on that investment. So if you have an idea, I've had many ideas of mine, either stolen, given away, or developed myself. Take those three as the options. Ideas that are stolen is never a good thing if your idea to be stolen. So you need to be mindful enough in order to be able to control your own intellectual property. Once you get to the point where you understand what you have and the currency that it's worth, you need to be able to trade that. So you have to be happy sometimes to give that to someone else for a return. So the question is, if you don't know, then you're not getting anything in return. But if you do know and you're giving away that currency, or you expect to get something, or you have already got something in return. So for me, the idea is that if I have something that I want to do and it's something that I'm really passionate about, I feel like it's something that only I want to do, then I'm going to be a lot more careful when I have those people in the room. I'll probably have more people in the room, and I'll probably structure it so that they know that it's my idea I'm sharing with them, which is kind of different to if I have an idea that I think is good, but somebody else can execute it better than me, and they'll probably take credit for it, which is fine. But I know and they know that it was my idea. And when it comes to it and it's us in the room, they can't hide the fact that it was my idea. And I know that they know that. And so that in itself is currency. And so, when we're sitting in the meeting room and something happens and we look at each other, they know what I know and I know what they know. And that in itself can help you. So then to touch on another point, if you need sponsors, if you're looking for a sponsor and your sponsor is somebody who you've been basically feeding some great ideas to, and you're like, okay, I want to do this. Can you help me? You have something to trade. If right at the beginning you had an idea and they kind of wanted it and it became hostile and that relationship got burnt, it's a whole different scenario. So it's about understanding what currency you have.
Thanks, Kwesi. Yemi, you had an initial reaction to it when you heard the question. So we all want to know what was in your head when you heard that question asked.
Yes, please.
Actually, I was going to be like, oh, that you're going to not be that excited. And I say, no, I think it's one of those ones that's really tough in terms of people stealing your ideas. And the strategy I adopt is a bit like Kwesi, because you trade them. Yeah. So, so you have, most of us that you come up with, as Claire said, when you get to certain levels, you're there because you're bloody competent. Yeah. Because to be honest, coming from our background, you don't get to certain levels unless you have that excellence. We can't get away with being shoddy and getting to a certain level, right? So what you need to be doing is thinking about, okay, what's the value of each of the ideas that I have, and feed them the ones that's not too valuable, but also buys you something in the bank. So when you do need something, you can then trade that. But most importantly, the ones that you know will really take you to potentially the next level and potentially the organization to another level, make sure you work in it. And it might mean extra hours. So an example I had, for example, one of the organizations I was head of finance was, I had a fantastic idea, which actually was going to help them in terms of benchmarking. And when we implemented it, it actually shaved millions off the business. But I had to work on it in my own time, because I thought, you know, I knew it was going to revolutionize not just the business, but in actual fact, the sector. So I was not going to be giving that one away. And by the time I sort of presented to my boss, there was no way she could just say, oh, this one is mine. She supported me. But the only reason she supported me was because I've given her smaller ideas that made her look good. Right? So listen, if there's anything you want to remember from tonight, make your boss look good. All right? I know, like Kwesi, I used to look at some of the guys I was reporting to thinking, why am I reporting to this? All right? But when you realize that actually you make them look good, and believe me, they will pay back, you know. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Sammy. Rob, I wanted to come to you because when you answered the question earlier, you talked about how one of the barriers is a personal barrier for you. How did you overcome? Do you want to share an example of a personal barrier that you had, and how did you overcome that?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the key challenges, and it was actually overcome by my former organization providing a therapist, which was just absolutely brilliant, because what you begin to realize for me was just that I control the manifestation of the game from my point of view. So to the point that Kwesi and Yemi made, I thought of a Jay-Z lyric was, well, you say you made Hove, then make another Hove. It's as simple as that, because I have plenty where that came from. So
I love that lyric.
And the problem is that when you are Black, and when you are a minority, and when you are living in a colonized country that's done very, very well off the back of various industrial pursuits that happened a few hundred years ago, you start to doubt yourself to a certain extent. You also develop a bit of a warrior complex. So you're ready to go to war at any second with anybody at any time. And what was really interesting about the therapy and the way that it was manifested was that you began to understand that, again, you're in control. I don't look at a CEO as somebody who has any reign over me in any particular way. You can choose to work with me just as I choose to work with you. And if you don't wish to, then we can part ways. And if I have an idea, I will share it freely, because to Yemi's point, that's the one that I wish to give you. The one that I think I wish to retain for myself, I will do so. And I have the opportunity to do so. So the more I realized that the rules of the game are mine, and they're mine to have, even down to what I wear, the fact I have tattoos, or I choose to live in a completely different country, are my choices. And I do so because it makes me happy, and I'm free to do so. Now, the key thing is there's only one metric that matters: performance. So if you're able to perform at a world-class level, then we can talk about a particular topic. I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at. But what I'm good at, I'm bloody good at. And that's worth something. So the more that you begin to realize, for everybody, even at a really junior level, that it revolves around you and your mindset. It's nothing to do with the organization. The organization has had limits before you, will have limits after you. It's nothing to do with society. Society will have limits before you and after you. But if you can, and we'll come on to this a little later on, I suspect, if you can operate in that little bubble where you're neither arrogant nor too kind of depressed about your situation, it's amazing what can happen. And that happened to me by complete luck and a good therapist. If he's watching right now, he's probably laughing his bits off, because I told him there was no way it would bloody work, and it has, which is really funny.
Thanks for sharing, Rob. And I want to just press on that point a little bit. Can that actually be the case? Is that dependent on the industry you're in? So Claire, you're in an investment banking environment. So Rob is talking about being himself, having his ink on his sleeve and all the rest of it, and bringing that to work. Do you think that applies across all environments? Do you think that strategy would work in an investment banking, financial services environment?
I think it can, and I think it depends again on your level of comfort, and maybe to some extent your level of seniority and how you think you can show up to work. So I work in engineering, which is technology, slightly more relaxed. People tend to be more themselves, slightly more, chilled out environment. Go into areas like banking, for example, or other areas where it's slightly more formal. I think there is a definite challenge for you to feel like you can bring your whole self to work, especially if your whole self doesn't look like 20 of the bankers that are on the desk, right? And so that really does become a challenge for you. I think that it's important, however, that you do strive to be able to bring yourself into that environment, because for me, the worst thing that you can do is try to be something that you're not, and try to fit into somewhere, into a mold that doesn't suit you, because ultimately, again, it will show up. It will become quite apparent that that isn't who you are. But you need to be thoughtful about how you do that, right? Earlier in my career, it was, I would have dreaded to tell anyone, the fact that I love carnival and I go and I participate in carnival in the Caribbean, like I'm telling you. But it's absolutely something I love, but I definitely would have cringed at the idea of even mentioning that previously, because you just felt like in an investment bank, that's not the done thing, and that's not what people would expect of you. But it was important to me to not only be open about who I am within my team, and actually, if you want a diverse workforce, this is what it looks like. This is some of the things that I would like to do, and this is stuff I do. But it's also important for the younger people that are coming up, that are looking at me and looking at the environment and thinking, is this somewhere I can actually thrive? And if they've got somebody who's, a senior woman saying, actually, I'm cooking rice and peas on the weekend and I did this, and, just feeling like they can belong, but also be true, I think has been, and is so key and is so important. So I think you do have to do it, but again, you'll understand the ways in which you can do it and when and where to do that. But I think it absolutely is important. And for any firm that wants to retain diverse people, you should be giving people space to be themselves.
Thanks, Claire. And I think you are leading us to where we're going to spend the rest of our time on this evening. How time goes so quickly is to talk about one of the things that comes as a result of having a diverse team in the workplace. And Stephen, I just want to acknowledge that I do see your question. I didn't glimpse over it. We're going to integrate it into our conversation now. And that is microaggressions. 2020 has been a significant year for a lot of different reasons. And one of them has been the conversations around race specifically. I said in the introduction to our conversation, there was a response to protests, Black Lives Matter, again, having to come into the fray to support the likes of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, et cetera. A lot of organizations talking about being anti-racist, a lot of organizations saying this is what our commitment is to diversity and specifically focusing on Black talent. Now, in terms of microaggression, I'm not sure if everybody knows who Kelechi Okafor is, but Kelechi is an influencer, has her own studio, really amazing individual. But she satirically started what she called Sally from HR as far back as 2018, where she's mimicking the HR conversations that you would have when you're bringing up certain things that could be microaggressive. And then on Sunday, recently, the New York Times, I recommend everybody read this article if you haven't done so already. They do a cover on Tijani Thiam, who was the former CEO of Credit Suisse, and why he was ousted. And within that, it's the first time I've ever seen a coverage on microaggressions, specifically in the workplace, specifically for a senior leader who is Black at CEO level. Haven't seen that. That's the first time I've seen that, and the New York Times covers it. So a couple of things to unpack with that context. Firstly, when people think about microaggressions, they are not gendered. So they happen to men, they happen to women. But let's start with women specifically. For you, Claire and Yemi, do you think that microaggressions show up differently for Black women in the workplace? So Yemi, I'll start with you first on that question. Do you think microaggressions show up differently for women, and specifically Black women in the workplace?
Yeah, yes, it definitely does, I would say. I mean, to be honest with you, not that's kind of giving away my age, during our time, we didn't have a name for it. It's only recently that this microaggression is like, oh, that's what was going on. Yeah, it is different for women. And the only example I can use is my sort of one of the roles that I had, combination of it being owned by an Asian family. But however, all of the people in senior positions were white. So it was coming from both sides. So with the Asian owners, who were absolutely wonderful, and I still, still really highly respect them to now, there was that sort of women having to be a little bit subservient kind of issue with them. And then obviously the sort of white people that are in high positions felt that black people. So you had it coming from both sides. And I suppose the one where it was most evident for me, and I was thinking what the hell was going on, was as with this organization, there's it's probably about 2 years average you work there. My boss was moved on, as it happens, and I was going to be moved into his office. And the ladies whose office was next to mine, everyone's frozen, can't hear me. Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, the lady who basically I was going to get my boss's office, and this is when the real microaggression, I've never seen anything like this. And the white lady that was the Karen, or whatever you can call her, who I was going to be having the same office as, were Oxford graduate, 10 years younger than me. I don't know why she felt threatened by me. She just refused to speak to me. She could not bear the thought of a black woman having the same size office next to her. And I've just never experienced anything like that. And I don't know how I handled it. I just find it odd. I knew she just kind of stopped talking to me. I'm thinking, what is the hell is going on here? And I think for my last 6 months in the organization, she never spoke to me because she just couldn't, for her, yeah, that was probably the worst I've experienced it. And I had silly things like people putting, stuff in my work, notes on my desk and stupid things like that. But I think the most I've experienced is that she just couldn't handle somebody up in the same office as her. So, but I don't know how to handle it. Because you think, what can we do? They need to deal with it. So it's a hard one, really.
And thanks for sharing, Yemi. It is a very difficult conversation, and I wanted to just, first of all, make sure that we had an example so people can gain context from a personal experience. And I just want to take a step back to say microaggressions are those micro moments of biases that are subtle, and it could be based on your race, on your age, on your hair, on your ink, your tattoo, on glasses, on the fact that you like Spurs, on everything. And as a result of that, when you look at those individual actions, it doesn't seem like something, but then you put that together, is the compound effect of what that means for the individual, which, to Yemi's point, it is difficult to deal with. Claire, I want to ask you the same question, and then tech team, get ready. I'll ask you for just a polling in a moment. But Claire, same question to you. Do you think that microaggressions show up differently for Black women in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess we're dealing with like the intersection of, being a woman and being Black, and some of the biases and inherent ways that you're seen or treated as a result of that. Often feeling unseen, or having people make assumptions for you. I remember earlier in my career, and to Yemi's point earlier, going into a meeting, I was the relationship manager, going in with a few other colleagues, all white men, and someone saying, yeah, Claire will take the notes. And just feeling extremely, I just couldn't believe it. I was furious. I didn't know what to say at that time because it was like at a client site and a client meeting. But I pulled him up about it after the meeting in the taxi on the way back to the office. And he was so apologetic, and he was, almost as if he hadn't realized what he'd done. But it was just, I just couldn't believe that you would make such a statement in front of a client, make an assumption, and just essentially have that perception that I was there to do that, as opposed to anything else. And it was the first time I was meeting the client, so I made it known. In other examples, and one actually, a couple of years ago, to do with hair, I actually had a black hair magazine in my bag, and I must have just put it on my desk. And a white male colleague, was said something along the lines of, "Oh, if I had a white hair magazine, that would be a problem." And I just thought, well, and I said it to him. Luckily, I have a good relationship with him, but I said to him, well, the reason I have this is because the mainstream books and magazines that you go to are all catered towards, Caucasian European hair. So that's why I have this book, and that's why these books are made for women like me. And he said, no, I understand it, but it still would be an issue. And I just couldn't understand why he was even making the point. And it was like he felt like me having a magazine that I wasn't showing or sharing around the office, it was my own personal magazine, was a problem for you. And so it definitely shows up, and that made me feel slightly insecure about, like, can I be myself? Can I actually bring those things to the workplace? But, I like I said, I stood my ground and I said, there is a reason that I have this. And if you can't see why, then that you're part of the problem. And, that was a couple of years ago. But, not everybody's going to have the confidence or feel comfortable in saying that in that kind of environment. So, it's a problem.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Just a point. One of the things is, because I'm horrified to hear some of the things that happen to Black professional women right across the board. And you hear stories like this, I think, are some of the PG rated versions of what's happening to Black women. Just the point I wanted to make was because my mother was one of the people who in the 70s and 80s was part of a class of Black women who blazed the trail for Black professionals in this country. Black females were the first people in offices, the first people to be typists and secretaries and those types of things. So it horrifies me to see how far things have changed and to hear consistently from colleagues and friends and family what's been happening. And I could go into it a lot just in terms of, from an anthropological perspective, what's happened, but it's just horrific when we think about, we actually owe as Black professionals, we owe just our professional living to those people who particularly, 60s, 70s, 80s had to go through horrific things back then. And to hear that it's Black women going through horrific things now just absolutely appalls me. And it's insane. It's absolutely insane. And I could go on and on, but don't want to derail things, but just
no, it's not derailing at all. I think it's I mean, if Yemi and Claire, I think we could have done a whole hour and a half just on microaggressions itself and how you address, those topics. I do want to bring both you, Rob, and Kwesi in the conversation, and also want to just hear as well from the participants. So tech team, if you could just pull up the last question on microaggressions specifically, so we can see where people are experiencing microaggressions the most. Is it performance conversations? Is it team meetings? Is it networking events? Is it ad hoc outings? If you're not invited, select ad hoc outings. And as people are responding to that same question, but from your perspective, Kwesi and Rob, do you think microaggressions show up differently for Black men in the workplace? Kwesi, I'll start with you first.
Yes, is the simple answer. I think that the main thing, so microaggressions you define perfectly. And that's something else to roll into there. We've talked a bit about biases. And I think the third element of it is something known as stereotype threat. So this is the idea that people have a certain stereotype of you. And in order to confound the threat of that stereotype, you change your behavior. And there's a great book called Whistling Vivaldi. And it's called Whistling Vivaldi because the example that he gives is of a young man who would walk through a park and at night, and people would see him and clutch their bag and be afraid. So what he started doing was whistling Vivaldi. And if you know who Vivaldi is, he's a classical singer. So now when somebody, white female, let's say, sees somebody and feels the threat, but then hears that Vivaldi playing, they will change their behavior. All of a sudden, they're not so afraid anymore. Somebody who's a threat would not be listening to Vivaldi, surely. And that's something that so you have the microaggressions, the way that you have to adapt yourself, and then we talk about bringing your whole self to work. I mean, it's almost an impossibility. I think that when we talked a bit about in banking, being a career banker, for me personally, when I started my career, I didn't have hair like this. Everything was cut off. Actually, when I finished university, I had hair like this. And for my first interview, I cut my hair. So for about 10 years, I had normal hair. It's only more recently that I grew my hair. And what changed was, we talked about earlier, I became more senior. I had a lot more experience and confidence. And the thing that changed as well was time. Back then, I got my job at Goldman Sachs. I don't know if I walked into an interview looking like this, they would have given me that job, you know, but things change. So the stereotype threat, the microaggressions that we have to face on a daily basis, and the challenge really is how to manage that. For me personally, I think to answer the quiz, for me, the biggest challenge is the team structure, being in a team environment. Mainly because when we have people of, well, when you're, how can I put this? When they're in that herd environment, they feel a bit more protected, let's say. I find that often when I'm one-to-one with someone, they're not going to say certain things that they'd say in that team room. And that's something that, you know, you have to be able to defy, stand up to. Don't let them, you know, it's very easy to kind of let it go because you don't want to cause a scene. You don't want to be that guy. And back to the stereotype threat, you don't want to be the aggressive, loud black man. So the incentive for you is actually, I need to be, and to touch on your point, Tijan Chain. So this article in New York Times, for anybody who hasn't seen it, talked about how he was CEO of Credit Suisse. You mentioned that there hasn't been many articles about this or similar at this level. That's because he was the only black CEO in banking. Now there are zero. So there was one, and now he's gone. But yeah, I think the aggressions in that he described, being at parties and having people dressed in Afro, sing songs that were inappropriate, those things are normal. And I don't think that if he had tattoos, he would have become CEO. I ended there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my comment around to John is not CEO in banking. I mean, CEO full stop. So there have been other Black CEOs. We have never seen a coverage like this. And I think the reason why that happens now is because, to your point earlier, because the times have changed and people are open to having conversations about the real reasons that individuals are let go, rather than the emails. I'm sorry, one second, Kwesi. Rather than the emails that you would get that said, oh, such and such has gone on to spend time with their family, and then that's it. And then you know there's a backstory, but you don't usually get that backstory. I want to pull in Rob. Quick point from you, Kwesi.
I just wanted to say that at that time when it was happening, to me and to a lot of us probably, it was obvious that there was racism happening, and this was a racist incident. What I'm glad is that it's taken so long, but now people are able to discuss it. So this is the upside of all of this, is that actually that New York Times article was amazingly written, 11 great sources and great content for anyone who wants to actually read facts as opposed to any conjecture.
Yeah. Thanks, Kwesi. Highly recommend the article if you haven't read it yet. Rob, same question to you. And if we could stop the poll, please, that would be great. I'll ask for results in just a second. But Rob, over to you. Microaggressions showing up differently for Black men, and you talked about, from an anthropological perspective, for Black women, what you've seen and are seeing. Just specifically for a Black male experience, from your perspective, do they show up differently? How has it shown up differently for you?
I think it's really interesting, and Dr. Rodney Collins, who's hopefully tuned in, I need to give him a kind of a thank you for this. We were discussing this the other day in terms of racism is a man-made construct. It's relatively new. It was actually created in order to facilitate a lot of the kind of genocide that happened afterwards. But part of it is the construct of having the savage and having the enemy, and you need to have some form of enemy from that point of view. Now, interestingly, once I began to understand some of these things, and it's a bit hippy dippy, because, and I've got friends who tell you I have a very short fuse, and I'm not averse to being ignorant when I'm required to do so, just not on this call. But what is interesting is that the more you can focus on performance. So to the point that the guys have made who are working in finance or working in engineering, it's not the norm to have tattoos and to be Black and to have braids and dreadlocks and those types of things. However, if you can outperform the next person by a factor of 10, it's funny how certain things get to slide. You see people walking around in bare feet if it was kind of possible, if your performance is that good. So we, for the junior people, yes, we've all done it. I've done the same as Kwesi. I've cut my hair in order to appear more attractive for a particular role. And yes, when you're senior, you can sometimes take more risk. One of the things I've tried to focus on when we first discussed this was that I've actually hit a stage where I'm actually not aware of when the microaggressions are happening, because I'm just assuming that's your problem, because it ain't my problem. I'm too busy focused on what can I do to ensure my performance is where it can be. Now, a great example of that is Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton has neck tattoos, braids, piercings. He's got the whole 9 yards. You ain't beating him in a Formula One car. And you can even show that because you can look at his teammate who isn't still doing as well as him in this epic car that can't be beaten. So all I can urge everybody to do, and it's the learning that I've had, and it took me a hell of a long time, is anything that takes away from my ability to perform at my absolute best and to keep improving and to keep learning and growing, I am not interested in. So if somebody wishes to make a microaggression towards me, I have done things like there was once I worked in an office where they were playing music and I was the only person of color in the office, and the music had a high proliferation of the N-word in it, which I didn't appreciate. So in language which I won't use here, I just advised that the next time somebody wishes to play that song, the speakers probably wouldn't be on the wall in the way in which they were at that time. I was going to forcibly remove them. That's one option. And another option is definitely, you know, how can I put it? I'll swear slightly. I do not allow fuckery into my atmosphere, and whether it's me being blissfully unaware or if I have to face it, then I shut it down unequivocally. Again, not something that's for everybody. Take the Gandhi route when you can, but sometimes you have to use other means by any means necessary, I think is the popular quote.
Is that what slightly swearing is? What is the full throttle and we get all guns blazing?
Unfortunately, I have a very loud voice and phlegm starts to fly and all those kind, which I've also done. I've also done that as well. There's been situations, both microaggressions, both race related and also gender related, which I just simply will not put up with. And that's just a personal thing of mine. And yeah, sometimes it's more ignorant in nature. So any of my friends watching now are laughing their bits off that I'm describing this in a very conscious Gandhi-like manner.
Yeah. Thank you, Robin. Can you imagine we only have 5 minutes left? Time flies. So we have 2 things to do before we close this evening. I just want to let everybody know, if you have been on Twitter or wherever you are, hashtag BlackandBrilliant, we're going to take a couple of questions, only 2, because I don't want to stick to time commitment. We are going to have an after panel discussion. So if you want to stick around for the after panel discussion, we are going to continue some of these points in the after panel discussion. But I do want to take 2 questions, and I will ask you to be brief with your responses because we want to honor people and their time. So I want to go back up to Stephen Mitchell's question, which was, how can you communicate around, racial equality or microaggressive topics within the workplace? How do you do that? How do you actually communicate around that? So should I start with you, Yemi? Your quick 30-second advice on that point?
Yeah, I would definitely say, looking back, confront the individuals initially. And it's really interesting, as Kwesi said, it's funny how people behave individually as to when they are in a group. So one of the things I learned early in my career with a wonderful friend, still a best friend of mine now, she's just bold. Our manager, when he was acting like a bit of a, she would literally say, "Oh, Martin, could I have a word?" She would never embarrass him in front of us. She would literally call this guy into a room and say, "Look, what is the problem?" And invariably, he came out with a better, he behaved himself. So I find most bullies, most coward people, when you actually call them into a room, don't do it in an open plan, personally, it's my advice. Call them into a room on an individual basis and say, "Look, what you've said is quite offensive, and this is the reason why." And most people, first of all, they're shocked because 99% of people won't pull them in the room and talk to them, because we will just act up, we will just be offended, and then it's just got this awkward thing. So that's my advice. Actually start with the individual, call them into a room, say, this is what you've said, this is how it makes me feel. Nobody can argue how it makes you feel. They may try and say, "Well, I didn't mean it that way," whatever. But just say, "Look, this is how that statement made me feel. I'd really appreciate if you don't do it again." And you'll find actually, because they're not used to people calling them out individually. So I won't necessarily call them out in the open, but they say, "But if you do it again in public, unfortunately, I'm going to have to call you out." and leave it that way.
Thanks, Yemi. Tech team, if we could just pull up the poll so we can see the results, and I'll go to the second question and turn to you, Ete, for closing. So the results was ad hoc team outings, people aren't being invited or facing microaggressions, and that's 26%, excuse me, 32% team meetings, followed by then ad hoc team meetings. So no surprises there. There was a question, and I would like to say, would you say yes or no, or how? Over to you, Claire, for this one. How do you raise this to HR? Should you raise it to HR? 30-second response to that.
Absolutely. So I had a scenario again recently where it was a team meeting, and it was like an end of week fun quiz. Guess the celebrity. They started to give clues about who the celebrity is. And the first clue was around this person's born in Houston, Texas, 1981. I immediately thought Beyonce. Somebody thought George Floyd, and people in the room actually laughed. And contrary to what Yemi said, I actually said at that point, this is not funny, and removed myself, and I actually did flag it. Now, the individual afterwards, again, very apologetic, and wanted to have a conversation, and I had the conversation, but I felt it was important at that time because there were junior people in the team and there were other people in the team that they should understand that that wasn't funny, and then the person themselves actually at the next team meeting took it upon themselves to say this was not meant as a joke. It literally was the first name that popped into the head. I don't, whether or not that's the case, irrelevant, but they did do that. But at that time, I definitely spoke to HR, right? I had a direct conversation because I think it's important now more than ever that you talk about these things and you make it clear to people and to the organization where these things are happening and how they impact you. That Friday, I was so just drained, upset, frustrated, angry. And it's something that could potentially affect my performance, to Rob's point, or not make me want to participate in a team meeting. So I think it's important that you do have those conversations with HR. They're there to support you and help in this.
Thank you, Claire. And with that brings us to the end of our conversation. I want to now hand over to Ete Davies, who is the CEO of Engine and the Black and Brilliant UK chapter lead. And for those of you who want to join the after panel conversation, we will be doing that shortly after Ete's address. Over to you, Ete.
Well, thank you first, Sabrina, for hosting a great panel. As Antoinette said, I mean, like, just gripping and engaging. So thank you to all the panelists, Claire, Yemi, Rob, Kwasi. I'm sure everyone enjoyed as much as I do listening to the wisdom, the insight, and just honestly, the realness shared by each of you tonight. Just so much helpful guidance and value from what you shared, from Claire's points on understanding what makes you unique. You're building from your own values, and your authenticity is actually your competitive advantage. Kwasi's points around growth and learning from mistakes. There's something I've really sort of taken on board from what you said around the reaction to an event determines your outcome. So be clear on what the outcome that you want is, and then base your reaction on that, being more conscious around that. Rob, yeah, totally agree with you about making a move and evaluate what that move does for your narrative. So always think about the next steps that you're taking. And then Yemi, especially your point around building two relationships up, because when you're making that progression to leadership, that visibility and decision-making often might happen levels above that of your line manager. So how do you make sure you're forming the right relationships that help you control your own destiny? So much in this. So thank you for all of you. What we're trying to achieve with Black and Brilliant UK, particularly within the sub-chapter of the UK, is to drive more representation of Black and underrepresented senior professional leadership, from the board level through to exec director or senior level before, and doing that through accelerating our middle tier, really equipping people with the cheat codes and the guidance and the insight that you've seen in this panel to navigate their careers with confidence, clarity, and champions by their sides. And secondly, most importantly, driving advocacy within the corporate sector, engaging and recruiting companies that want to join the mission, and show a real commitment to reporting and publishing their strategies and progress towards greater representation and leadership. So if you're listening, whether you're on that career journey or if you're from an organization and wants to think what you can do for change, please join the network, or get involved supporting any of the activities. You can do this through the LinkedIn group. I think we've got, can we share that slide with the details on it?
Slide 5, thanks.
Yeah, so there you can see, you can join on the LinkedIn group where you'll find all the details of Black and Brilliant. Obviously, this content is also on YouTube and on Twitter. There are several subgroups and several areas that we're tackling within Black and Brilliant, so you can help support us regionally across the US, Canada, and of course the UK, or in a specific focus area, be that recruitment, mentoring, film, TV and content, finance and banking, or data science, to name a few. We plan to host many, many more events on this theme, but also others, and share lots of supporting content, hopefully have a mixer in the next few months for everyone based in the UK. So please sign up and stay in touch. Thanks to everyone for attending and joining us tonight, and enjoy the after panel discussion if you're joining that as well. Good night.